Sophie nodded, understanding. Ravenwood had that effect on people. They often left, but the town always called them back, like a forgotten melody that lingered in the back of one's mind. Well, if you need any recommendations or help finding something, just let me know, Sophie offered. Thank you, Lucas said, his smile widening. I think I'll just browse for now. As Lucas wandered through the aisles, Sophie found it hard to concentrate on her book. There was something about him that drew her in, a quiet mystery that she couldn't quite place. She watched as he ran his fingers along the spines of the books, occasionally pulling one out to inspect the cover before placing it back. An hour passed before Lucas approached the counter with the book in hand. I think I'll borrow this one, he said, handing it to Sophie. Sophie glanced at the title, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bront. A classic, she said, smiling. One of my favorites. Chapter 3, The Winter's Embrace. Over the next few weeks, Sophie and Lucas spent more and more time together. They met for coffee, went for walks in the snow-covered park, and even visited the local Christmas market, where they laughed and shared stories as they browsed the stalls. As they grew closer, Sophie found herself falling for Lucas in a way she had never experienced before. There was something about him that felt different, something that made her believe in the possibility of love in a way she never had before. But despite the growing bond between them, there was always a hint of melancholy in Lucas' eyes, a shadow that Sophie couldn't quite understand. He never talked about his life in the city in great detail, and whenever she asked about his plans for the future, he would change the subject or give vague answers. One evening, as they sat together in the park, watching the Christmas lights twinkle in the trees, Sophie finally gathered the courage to ask. "Hi," Sophie replied, her own smile mirroring his. "Shall we go in?" They entered the cozy shop, the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee enveloping them. They ordered their drinks. Sophie opted for a simple latte, while Lucas chose a black coffee, and found a small table by the window. "So, what brings you back to Ravenwood after all this time?" Sophie asked once they were settled, genuinely curious. Lucas took a sip of his coffee before answering. "My parents still live here, and I wanted to spend the holidays with them. I've been so caught up with work that I haven't visited in years." "What do you do?" Sophie asked, leaning in slightly. "I'm an architect," Lucas replied. "I design buildings, mostly in the city." "That sounds amazing," Sophie said, impressed. "It must be rewarding to see your designs come to life." "It is," Lucas agreed. "But it can also be stressful. That's one of the reasons I wanted to come back." It was a winter like no other in the small town of Ravenwood. Snowflakes danced gently from the sky, blanketing the streets in a pristine white that made everything seem more magical, almost dreamlike. The townsfolk bustled about, preparing for the upcoming holidays, but for Sophie Bennett, the season had always been more of a quiet, reflective time. Sophie, with her chestnut brown hair and kind hazel eyes, had lived in Ravenwood her entire life. At 27, she was the librarian at the town's small library, a quaint place that seemed frozen in time. She loved the library, not just for the books it housed, but for the stories it told, both written and unwritten. Sophie found comfort in the rows of dusty books, and the scent of old pages. It was her sanctuary. One cold December afternoon, as she sat behind the wooden counter, engrossed in a novel, the bell above the library door jingled, announcing a visitor. Sophie looked up, expecting to see one of the regular patrons, but instead, a man she had never seen before stepped inside. He was tall, with dark hair that fell messily over his forehead, and his blue. The stranger walked in slowly, taking in the surroundings as if he was stepping back into a memory. Sophie watched him for a moment before she cleared her throat, drawing his attention. "Hello, can I help you with something?" she asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant. The man smiled, a small, almost nostalgic smile. "I'm just looking around," he said, his voice deep and warm. "I used to come here when I was a kid, but it's been a long time." "Welcome back," Sophie replied, her curiosity piqued. "It's a lovely place, isn't it?" "It is," he agreed, his gaze wandering over the shelves. "It feels like nothing has changed." "Not much has," Sophie said, closing her book and standing up. "Except for a few new additions to the collection, it's pretty much the same." The man nodded, and for a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, the only sound the faint ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. "I'm Sophie, by the way," she finally said, extending her hand. "Lucas," he replied, taking her hand in his. His grip was firm yet gentle, and Sophie couldn't help but notice the warmth that radiated from his touch. "Lucas," Sophie repeated, as if testing the name on her tongue. "I don't think I've seen you around here before." "I've been away for a long time," Lucas explained. "I used to live here, but I moved to the city years ago. I'm back for the holidays to visit my family." "Mine too," Lucas replied. There's something hauntingly beautiful about it. Sophie nodded in agreement as she processed the checkout. You're all set, she said, handing the book back to him. Enjoy. I will, Lucas said, taking the book. Thank you, Sophie. As he turned to leave, Sophie felt a pang of disappointment. She didn't want the conversation to end, didn't want him to walk out of her life just as quickly as he had walked in. But before she could say anything, Lucas paused at the door. Would you like to grab a coffee sometime? He asked, turning back to face her. His expression was hopeful, almost as if he feared she would say no. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. I'd love that, she replied, trying to keep the excitement out of her voice. Great, Lucas said, relief washing over his features. How about tomorrow? Tomorrow sounds perfect. With one last smile, Lucas left the library, the bell jingling softly behind him. Sophie watched him go, a warm feeling spreading through her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, everything felt right. Chapter 2, The Growing Connection. The next day, Sophie found herself standing outside the town's only coffee shop, her breath visible in the cold air as she waited for Lucas. She had arrived early, her nerves getting the better of her. Despite the chill, she felt a warmth inside her that had nothing to do with the wool coat she wore. She didn't have to wait long. Lucas arrived a few minutes later, his cheeks flushed from the cold, but his smile just as warm as it had been the day before. Hey, he greeted. Here, to take a break and recharge. Sophie nodded. Ravenwood has a way of doing that. It's so peaceful here, almost like time stands still. Exactly, Lucas said, his eyes meeting hers. That's what I've missed the most, the simplicity, the quiet. It's a nice change from the chaos of the city. They continued talking, the conversation flowing easily as they shared stories about their lives. Sophie told Lucas about her love for books and how she had ended up as the town librarian, a job she adored despite its modesty. Lucas, in turn, shared his passion for architecture, his dreams of designing something truly iconic. One day, as the hours passed, Sophie found herself growing more and more drawn to Lucas. He was easy to talk to, with a calm demeanor that put her at ease. There was a depth to him, a quiet strength that she admired. And yet, despite the comfort she felt in his presence, there was also a sense of excitement, a flutter in her stomach every time he smiled at her, or said her name. By the time they left the coffee shop, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the town. They walked together, their steps slow and unhurried, neither of them wanting the day to end. Thank you for today, Lucas said as they reached the library, where Sophie had parked her car. I had a great time. Me too, Sophie replied, her heart pounding in her chest. I'm glad we did this. Maybe we can do it again sometime, Lucas asked, his tone hopeful. I'd like that, Sophie said, a smile tugging at her lips. Great, Lucas said.